For 500 years, Vikings terrorized Europe unchallenged. Then, from the Baltic shores, came warriors so fierce that Danish mothers taught their children to pray, "God, save us from the Curonians." The hunters had become the hunted, and Scandinavia would burn. In 1187, Sweden's capital was sacked, not by rival Vikings, but by Baltic tribes. The world forgot. The entire Viking Age power structure was about to collapse. By the end of this video, you'll understand how unknown Baltic warriors reversed 500 years of Viking dominance. Why Vikings prayed to their enemies' gods in desperation. How Baltic pirates forced Scandinavia to militarize its own shores. The forgotten naval tactics that turned Viking longships into death traps. Picture this. Sigtuna, Sweden's holy city, 60 kilometers inland farther than any Viking raid ever penetrated enemy territory. Yet Baltic warriors reached it, burned it, and vanished before Swedish forces could respond. Swedish scouts saw something impossible: pagan raiders using Viking tactics better than Vikings themselves. But here's what the sagas won't tell you. This wasn't the first time Baltic tribes humiliated Scandinavia. The story begins 333 years earlier, when two Viking kingdoms united to crush a Baltic fortress. They brought 30,000 men. They had the finest weapons in Europe. They controlled the seas. What happened next would shatter everything they believed about warfare, about honor, about their own invincibility. 3 questions haunt this tale. How did a force half their size destroy the greatest Viking army ever assembled? Why did Swedish warriors abandon their own gods and pray to Christ in desperation? What made these Baltic defenders so terrifying that Vikings would pay them tribute, reversing 5 centuries of extortion? The fortress held a secret that would reshape northern Europe. Danish ships met unexpected resistance from an enemy they'd raided for generations. Swedish kings would learn that some shores were better left untouched. To understand how Vikings became prey, we must first understand their predators. Who were these Baltic terrors who would one day sail up Swedish rivers and burn the holiest sites in Scandinavia? If you're fascinated by the untold stories of history's most decisive battles, hit that like button and subscribe for more epic war content. Now, let me take you back to 854 AD, when 15,000 Baltic warriors stood against the might of Scandinavia in a siege that would shatter Viking supremacy forever. The Baltic Sea in 854 wasn't just water, it was a Viking highway. Danish longships ruled the western routes. Swedish raiders dominated the eastern passages. Between them lay the Curonian shores, where every man was a raider, every settlement a fortress, and every boat a potential warship. You have to understand, Vikings didn't lose. For 3 centuries, they'd perfected the art of coastal terror. Their shallow draft longships could navigate rivers others couldn't. Their berserker warriors fought with supernatural fury. Their reputation alone made cities surrender. Then they met the Curonians. The Amber Road had made these Baltic tribes wealthy beyond measure. Roman coins flowed north in exchange for golden resin. But here's the detail that changes everything. That wealth didn't create soft merchants. It funded a war machine that would make Vikings look like amateurs. Where Vikings raided seasonally, Curonians lived in perpetual readiness for war. Their society was built different. No kings, no central authority, just warrior communities bound by blood and plunder. Every free man owned weapons. Every boy learned to fight before he could plow. Every family kept fast horses for warning networks that could alert the entire coast in minutes. This is where legend meets horrific reality. Viking expansion had hit an immovable object. Danish King Horik had learned this the hard way. His raids on Curonian settlements yielded less each year. The defenders adapted too quickly, disappeared too efficiently, struck back too viciously. Swedish King Olof faced similar frustration. His merchants paid more for protection from Curonian pirates than they earned in trade. Both kingdoms bled silver into Baltic hands. Then something happened that changed Baltic warfare forever. The 2 Viking kingdoms, traditional rivals, began coordinating. Danish naval power would combine with Swedish manpower. Together, they would end the Curonian threat permanently. The plan was simple: destroy Apule, the greatest Curonian fortress, and break their confederation forever. But the Curonians had studied their enemy too well. They knew Viking tactics because they used them. They understood Viking psychology because they shared it. Most crucially, they recognized Viking weaknesses because they exploited them. Every successful Viking raid had taught Curonians how to defend. Every failed Baltic assault had taught them how to counterattack. The fortress of Apule stood on a hill overlooking the Venta River, 30 miles inland, far enough to prevent naval assault, close enough to control trade routes. Its earthen ramparts rose 40 feet high. Its timber palisades could stop any cavalry charge. Its killing field stretched 200 meters in every direction. But Olaf had overlooked one crucial detail. This wasn't just a fortress. It was bait. Character intrigue centered on Curonian war chief Lamachus, a leader who negotiated with Rome while fighting Scandinavia. His strategic genius lay not in traditional leadership, but in coordinated resistance. When Viking armies massed, Curonian communities merged. When Vikings sought single combat, Curonians fought as units. When Vikings expected barbarian chaos, they found disciplined killing machines. The Danes brought 20,000 warriors in 200 ships. Sweden contributed 10,000 men and dreams of Baltic dominance. Against them stood 15,000 Curonians, who had never lost a major defensive battle. Two kingdoms united for vengeance against warriors who had turned Viking methods into Viking nightmares. Dawn revealed the full scope of disaster waiting to unfold. Danish longships darkened the horizon, 200 vessels carrying the finest warriors in Scandinavia. Each ship bore 100 men, mail-clad and eager for plunder. Their round shields glinted with fresh paint, their axes sharp enough to split Baltic skulls. King Horik himself commanded from his dragon-proud flagship, its golden weathervane catching the morning sun. The Swedish force marched overland 10,000 strong under King Olaf's personal command. Heavy cavalry led the column, their horses bred for Baltic mud. Behind them came the infantry, spearmen who'd conquered Finnish tribes and Estonian settlements. Pack trains followed, loaded with siege equipment and enough supplies for a month-long campaign. What Vikings found inside the fortress defied all logic, not panic, but terrible preparation. At Apule, 15,000 defenders waited, but the numbers are staggering when you understand the context. This represented every fighting man within 3 days' ride. Farmers had become soldiers. Merchants had become archers. Boys, barely old enough to lift swords, stood beside grandfathers who remembered the first Viking raids. The tactical genius was almost supernatural. They'd turned demographic desperation into military advantage. The fortress itself mocked conventional siege wisdom. Its circular earthworks rose in 3 concentric rings, each higher than the last. Timber palisades crowned each rampart, their posts driven deep and bound with iron. Between the walls lay killing grounds, cleared spaces where no attacker could find cover. Here's where the story takes a dark turn. The defenders had burned their own homes outside the walls, denying Vikings any shelter or loot. Can you imagine the terror of approaching such defenses? No glory in climbing earthen slopes while arrows fell like rain. No honor in dying in carefully prepared kill zones. No plunder in empty, smoking ruins. Swedish commanders faced an impossible choice assault. A fortress designed to break armies, or starve, while Curonian raids hit their supply lines. Pre-battle negotiations revealed the stakes. Olaf demanded submission and tribute standard Viking terms. The Curonian response shocked both armies. They offered single combat between champions, winner take all. When Vikings refused, knowing Curonian champions fought without rules or mercy, the defenders made a counteroffer. Leave now, and only half the Viking force would die on the journey home. Stay, and none would see Scandinavia again. The irony is almost unbearable. Vikings, masters of psychological warfare, faced enemies who'd perfected their own tactics. Every threat rang hollow against defenders who'd chosen death over submission. Every display of strength met calculated indifference. Danish berserkers, howling and biting their shields, faced Curonian warriors who watched in silent contempt. Little did the Danes know what waited in the shallows of the Venta River. Curonian boats, smaller, faster, able to navigate in knee-deep water lay hidden in reed beds and tributary mouths. Their crews had spent days mapping Danish anchor points and calculating tide schedules. The trap was about to spring, on multiple levels. Commander profiles revealed the coming tragedy. King Olaf, ambitious and desperate for victory, had staked his reputation on this campaign. His Swedish lords demanded Baltic submission or royal humiliation. King Horik, older and more cautious, recognized the fortress's strength, but couldn't withdraw without losing Danish prestige. Neither could afford defeat. Against them stood warriors whose names history barely preserved. War Chief Lamachus commanded the center. His subordinates controlled fortress sections with independence. If one wall fell, others would fight on. The next 3 days would determine Baltic supremacy for centuries. Swedish scouts reported something impossible the night before battle. Curonian women and children sang from the walls. Not lamentations, but war songs. The meaning was clear. This wasn't just a military defense. This was a people's war, where every soul had chosen victory or death. Swedish morale collapsed. Indicators appeared immediately. Soldiers made wills. Priests heard more confessions. Veterans spoke openly of bad omens. As dawn broke over Apulei, 30,000 men prepared for a siege that would redefine Baltic power. Vikings expected a traditional assault rams against gates, ladders against walls, shields locked in the fatal press. They would receive something far worse. The fortress wasn't just defended, it was a trap designed by warriors who thought like Vikings but fought like nothing Scandinavia had ever seen. Dawn would bring apocalypse. Day one began with Swedish confidence. Olaf's forces formed siege lines with textbook precision heavy infantry in the center, missile troops on the flanks, cavalry reserves positioned to exploit any breach. Danish ships controlled the river, preventing Curonian escape or reinforcement. The investment looked perfect. Then came the moment that would echo through centuries. The first assault launched at midday. Swedish infantry advanced behind locked shields, while Danish warriors prepared to exploit any success. Arrows darkened the sky from both sides. Then the killing truly began. Curonian defenders had prepared something special weighted javelins that punched through Viking shields and mail. The advancing line staggered, stumbled, and broke apart. But wait, it gets worse. What happened next defied all military logic. As Vikings reached the first earthwork, the ground collapsed. Curonians had dug concealed pits, covered with thin wood and earth. Armored warriors plunged into stakes below. Screams mixed with battle cries as the attack dissolved into chaos. This single decision would cost thousands of lives. Olaf ordered continued assault rather than tactical withdrawal. Wave after wave crashed against Apulei's defenses. Each attack met new horrors. Boiling water poured from the walls. Logs rolled down ramparts, crushing climbing warriors. Curonian archers, positioned in overlapping fields of fire, turned every approach into a death trap. By sunset, Swedish dead carpeted the killing grounds. Danish observers counted their blessings. Their turn hadn't come yet. But the Curonians weren't finished. That night, they launched counter-raids that would define the siege's character. Small groups slipped through Viking lines, struck at supply wagons, and vanished. Swedish sentries died silently, their throats cut by warriors who moved like shadows. What followed would shatter Viking assumptions about defensive warfare. Day 3 brought starvation tactics, but not as Vikings expected. Curonians had poisoned every well outside their walls, burned every farm within riding distance, driven off all livestock. The besiegers, expecting to live off the land, found only scorched earth. Danish foraging parties met Curonian ambushers who knew every trail and stream. History turned on this single command. Horik ordered his ships to raid farther downstream for supplies. Day 5 witnessed religious desperation that would haunt Swedish warriors for generations. King Olaf, his army bleeding out against unstormable walls, made a decision that shocked his pagan warriors. He prayed to the Christian God. Swedish soldiers, watching their king kneel in the mud before a wooden cross, felt their world shifting. Think about that, praying to your enemy's God because your own had abandoned you. The archaeological evidence reveals something shocking about this moment. Excavations at Apuole found Christian symbols mixed with pagan offerings, Vikings desperately invoking any divine aid. But Curonian defenders had their own gods, Baltic deities of war and death who demanded enemy blood. The spiritual battle paralleled the physical one, and Vikings were losing both. Swedish morale collapse indicators multiplied. Soldiers refused night watches, fearing Curonian raiders. Wounded men begged for quick deaths rather than lingering agony. Veterans spoke openly of retreat. This is where tactics became slaughter organization, dissolved into desperate individual survival. Then the Danes made a fatal error that would cost them everything. Seeking easier targets than Apulei's walls, Danish raiders sailed downstream to attack Curonian settlements. They found Grobinja wealthy and apparently defenseless. Ships loaded with plunder, anchored in the river, crews celebrating their success. Geography had other plans for these Vikings. Night raids intensified with supernatural precision. Curonians struck where Vikings were weakest. Isolated sentries, supply lines, horse pickets, fire arrows turned the siege camp into an inferno of burning tents and panicking men. Every successful raid emboldened defenders and demoralized attackers. The psychological warfare reached crescendo when Curonian warriors threw Swedish heads from the walls while singing battle hymns. What happened next is barely believable. Swedish priests reported visions of Curonian gods walking the ramparts. Danish warriors swore they saw dead comrades fighting alongside defenders. Whether supernatural terror or exhaustion-induced hallucination, the effect was real. Vikings feared these walls held more than mortal enemies. By day 8, the situation had reversed completely. Vikings weren't besieging, they were trapped. Curonian raids had destroyed supply trains. Danish ships downstream had stopped responding to signals. Swedish cavalry, sent to investigate, never returned. The fortress had become a magnet, drawing Vikings to their doom. Every dead Viking created 2 Baltic raiders eager for revenge. King Olaf faced reality with royal desperation. His army couldn't take Apuole. They couldn't maintain the siege. They might not even retreat successfully. Traditional Viking warfare had met its master in defenders who understood every tactic and countered with superior discipline. Swedish prayers echoed from the wrong god. Christ offered no more aid than Odin. The screams from the Swedish camp changed everything that final night. Curonian raiders had infiltrated the hospital tents, killing wounded warriors who couldn't defend themselves. The message was clear: no mercy, no quarter, no survival for invaders. By dawn, with supplies exhausted and casualties approaching 30%, King Olaf faced an impossible choice: continue the siege and watch his army die piecemeal, or retreat and face Curonian pursuit. Either meant disaster, but one offered slim hope of survival. Olaf made his fatal choice. The final Swedish assault began in desperation rather than hope. Olaf gathered his remaining champions, berserkers, who'd sworn to die rather than retreat. These weren't soldiers anymore, but men seeking glorious death over shameful survival. They painted their shields black, marking themselves for Valhalla. Swedish horns sounded one last time, cracked and mournful in the morning mist. Religious fervor mixed with suicidal courage as warriors prepared for their last charge. 8,000 Swedes advanced in the pre-dawn darkness. They'd learned from previous failures. No packed formations for Curonian javelins to shatter, no predictable approaches for defenders to target. Instead, they came in scattered groups, each seeking its own path through the killing grounds. Some carried ladders, others bore hooks and ropes, all expected to die. The Baltic had grown Viking teeth, and now those teeth would feast on Swedish blood. But then the gates opened, not in surrender, but in something far more terrifying. Curonian warriors poured out in perfect formation, shields locked, spears leveled. This wasn't the chaotic charge Vikings expected from defenders. This was disciplined, calculated aggression. Behind the infantry came cavalry Baltic horsemen on small, fast mounts that danced through mud where Swedish horses foundered. The trap's sophistication became horrifyingly clear. Curonians had planned this false retreat for days. They'd identified the exact point where Viking discipline would break, where pursuit instinct would override tactical sense. They'd even prepared the ground. What looked like solid earth was actually bog covered with branches. As Vikings pursued seemingly fleeing defenders, they rushed into prepared catastrophe. 1,000 dead in 10 minutes. The statistics barely capture the slaughter. Swedish berserkers, charging ahead of their supports, found themselves isolated and surrounded. Curonian spearmen worked with mechanical efficiency, stabbing at legs and groats where armor was weakest. When Vikings fell, auxiliary troops with clubs ensured they never rose. The muddy ground became an abattoir of Swedish ambitions. Remember, these weren't professional soldiers meeting disciplined resistance. These were Viking warriors, raised on tales of individual glory, facing an enemy that fought as a single organism. Every Curonian knew their role. Every movement followed rehearsed patterns. When Swedish champions sought single combat, they met coordinated killing teams. Where Vikings expected honorable battle, they found systematic extermination. The false retreat continued with horrific precision. Curonian forces pulled back in stages, each withdrawal drawing Vikings deeper into prepared positions. Side channels suddenly filled with Baltic warriors who'd waited in concealment. What seemed like victory became encirclement. The screams of trapped Swedes echoed across the battlefield, but their comrades couldn't help. They were fighting for their own lives. Olaf himself led a desperate charge to save his trapped vanguard. His household warriors, the finest in Sweden, carved a bloody path towards surrounded comrades. For a moment, Viking fury seemed to prevail. Swedish axes split Curonian shields. Royal guardsmen fought with strength born of desperation. Then came the moment Vikings feared most. Curonian reserves struck both flanks simultaneously. The Swedish retreat began as organized withdrawal and ended as panicked flight. Unit cohesion shattered. Officers couldn't maintain control. Individual warriors threw away weapons to run faster. But Curonians had prepared for this too. Fresh troops waited along retreat routes. Mounted archers harried fleeing Vikings. Every 100 meters of retreat cost 50 Viking lives. What happened next would haunt Swedish warriors for generations. Curonian pursuit wasn't random violence but systematic destruction. They targeted officers first, breaking command structure. They crippled horses, forcing mounted warriors to fight on foot. They set fires to channel fleeing Vikings into killing grounds. This wasn't battle anymore. It was extermination executed with terrible efficiency. King Olaf's leadership crumbled with his army. Surrounded by dying guardsmen, abandoned by fleeing troops, he faced the ultimate Viking nightmare death without glory. Curonian warriors closed in, not as honorable opponents, but as executioners. The Swedish king, who'd prayed to Christ, died calling on Odin. His crown, symbol of Swedish power, vanished into Baltic hands. Meanwhile, the Danish force faced its own catastrophe. Word of Swedish collapse reached Horik's ships just as Curonian vessels appeared on the river. These weren't the trading boats Danes expected, but war galleys designed for ramming and boarding. Shallow draft construction let them navigate channels where Danish longships grounded. What followed wasn't naval battle but maritime massacre. The Grobinja sacking had been a trap within a trap. Curonian defenders had evacuated valuables before Danish arrival, leaving enough to fill Viking ships with heavy plunder. Now, overladen and sluggish, those ships couldn't maneuver in narrow waters. Baltic vessels struck like wolves among sheep. Their crews, experts in river warfare, turned Danish advantages into fatal weaknesses. Here's where it gets insane. The Curonians weren't defending anymore. They'd become hunters, and Vikings were prey. Danish ships tried forming defensive circles, shields out and spears bristling. But Curonian fire arrows turned wooden vessels into floating pyres. When Vikings abandoned burning ships, Baltic warriors waited in the shallows with spears and axes. The loss of accumulated loot meant more than material disaster. Viking armies funded themselves through plunder. Without it, survivors couldn't pay crews or replace equipment. Every chest of silver sinking in the Venta meant Danish power diminishing. Curonian divers would recover this treasure later, funding future raids on Scandinavian coasts. The economic reversal matched the military one. Individual combat vignettes revealed the changing dynamic. A Danish jarl, veteran of raids from England to Byzantium, died on a Curonian spear wielded by a teenage defender. Swedish berserkers, terrifying across Europe, fell to coordinated attacks by Baltic farmers. The mystique of Viking invincibility dissolved in muddy water and burning ships. Coastal ambushes continued the slaughter. Curonians had positioned forces at every potential landing site. Danes, seeking to beach their vessels, met warriors who knew every inlet and sandbar. The shallow draft advantage that made Viking raids possible now belonged to their enemies. Longships designed for offense became death traps when forced to defend. Every detail demonstrated Curonian preparation. They'd studied Viking tactics for generations, learned from every raid, adapted each defense. Now they applied those lessons with interest. Where Vikings expected individual combat, they met unit tactics. Where they sought mobile warfare, they found prepared positions. Where they relied on reputation, they faced enemies who'd moved beyond fear. The pursuit phase reached crescendo at the river mouth. Danish ships, racing for open sea, found the exit blocked. Curonian vessels had created a barrier of burning boats and sunken hulls. Behind them, Baltic warriors waited on both shores. The trap was complete. No escape by water, no survival on land. Danish desperation produced acts of hopeless courage that changed nothing. King Horik faced the unthinkable. His force, pride of Denmark, was being systematically destroyed. His kingdom's greatest warriors were dying in foreign mud. His treasury was sinking in Baltic waters. Traditional Viking honor demanded death before surrender, but pragmatism suggested survival might serve Denmark better. The final Danish humiliation came with sunrise. Curonian chiefs offered terms that reversed centuries of Viking dominance. Denmark would pay tribute 30 pounds of silver annually. Danish ships would seek permission before entering Baltic waters. Most humiliatingly, Denmark would provide hostages from noble families. The terrorizers had become tribute payers. Viking pride died harder than Viking warriors. The siege was over, but the real terror was just beginning. Survivors would carry tales of Curonian invincibility across Scandinavia. Every Viking mother would learn new prayers, not for successful raids but for protection from Baltic vengeance. The hunters had become meat, and the feast would last for centuries. Dawn revealed the full scope of catastrophe. Swedish and Danish dead carpeted the approaches to Apuole, nearly 10,000 corpses in Viking mail. 1 in 3 warriors who'd marched on the fortress would never return home. The immediate Viking losses went beyond numbers. They'd lost experienced raiders, proven leaders, and irreplaceable equipment. Most critically, they'd lost the aura of invincibility that made Viking expansion possible. The power vacuum in Baltic trade emerged immediately. Danish merchants, previously protected by military might, found themselves paying protection to Curonian ships. Swedish trading posts, established through force, faced demands for tribute or evacuation. The economic framework of Viking expansion raid, establish control, extract wealth collapsed when the military foundation crumbled. Every dead Viking created 2 Baltic raiders eager to reverse centuries of oppression. Curonian transformation from defenders to aggressors began before Viking bodies cooled. War councils convened in Apuole to plan something unprecedented: sustained offensive operations against Scandinavia itself. They had captured Danish ships, Swedish weapons, and crucial intelligence from prisoners. Baltic warriors who'd spent generations learning from Viking raids now prepared to teach their own lessons. The first revenge raids struck Swedish coasts within months. Blekinge burned as Curonian warriors applied Viking tactics with Baltic improvements. They struck harder, moved faster, and showed less mercy than any Scandinavian raider. Coastal settlements that had profited from eastern raids found themselves paying for ancestral crimes. The irony was excruciating. Swedish warriors were in Denmark, having died at Apuole when Baltic raiders burned their homes. The Oeselian alliance formation multiplied Scandinavian nightmares. Estonian islanders, master seafarers who'd resisted Viking dominance, joined Curonian campaigns. Together, they commanded more ships than Denmark could muster after Apuole losses. Their shallow draft vessels could navigate where Viking longships couldn't follow. Combined Baltic forces turned the Eastern Sea into a Scandinavian grave. Personal stories from Swedish survivors revealed psychological devastation. Warriors who'd faced English armies and Frankish cavalry spoke of Apuole with voices that shook. They described enemies who fought without fear, fortifications that couldn't be stormed, and tactics that made Viking methods obsolete. Some refused to sail east again. Others drank themselves to death rather than face memories of the siege. Veterans who'd laughed at danger now woke screaming from nightmares. Danish coastal abandonment began with fishing villages and spread to major settlements. Communities that had thrived for centuries packed their belongings and moved inland. The calculation was simple. Curonian raiders now controlled the sea lanes, and distance from water meant safety from Baltic vengeance. Archaeological evidence shows entire regions depopulated as Danes sought refuge from their own tactics turned against them. Curonian fleet expansion followed captured Viking designs improved with Baltic innovations. They built vessels that combined longship speed with enhanced shallow water capability. Their crews, trained from childhood in both sailing and combat, surpassed Viking seamanship. By year's end, Curonian naval forces could strike anywhere in the Baltic, at will. The sea that Vikings had ruled for centuries now answered to different masters. Here's the detail that explains everything about the aftermath. Curonians didn't seek to conquer Scandinavian territories. They aimed to make Viking life unbearable. Constant raids prevented farming. Burned settlements couldn't support populations. Destroyed ships couldn't carry trade. They were using Viking methods to achieve what Vikings had done to others: cultural and economic destruction through sustained terror. Death toll analysis went beyond battle casualties. Famine followed as Baltic raids disrupted food production. Disease spread through overcrowded inland settlements. Political instability erupted as Swedish and Danish nobles blamed kings for the disaster. The 10,000 dead at Apuole were just the beginning. Scandinavian losses would multiply over the following decades as Baltic vengeance extracted its price. The transformation was complete. Where once Viking sails meant terror for Baltic peoples, now Curonian vessels brought nightmares to Scandinavian shores. Prayers reversed. Instead of Baltic peoples begging for divine protection from Vikings, Scandinavian Christians pleaded for salvation from pagan raiders. Churches that had celebrated Viking victories now held masses for protection from the very peoples their warriors had terrorized. Swedish attempts to rebuild eastern defenses met consistent failure. Every fortress they constructed became a target for Curonian attack. Every garrison they established faced constant harassment. The defensive infrastructure needed to protect against Baltic raids would consume resources Sweden couldn't spare after Apule. Stockholm would eventually be founded specifically as a fortified response to this threat. Danish naval reconstruction proved equally futile. The loss of experienced crews at Apule couldn't be quickly replaced. Ships took time to build, sailors took years to train, and neither could happen under constant Curonian attack. Denmark's maritime dominance, built over centuries, had evaporated in 8 days of siege and slaughter. But the Curonians weren't finished, not by far. The sack of Apule had demonstrated Scandinavian vulnerability. Now came systematic exploitation. Every summer brought new raids. Every trading season saw more tribute flowing eastward. The Baltic peoples, oppressed for generations, had found their moment. They would make it last for centuries. This detail explains everything about the changing dynamic. Vikings had raided for profit and glory. Curonians raided for vengeance and security. They didn't seek momentary wealth but permanent Scandinavian weakness. Every burned church eliminated a rallying point. Every destroyed ship reduced future threats. Every dead warrior meant one less potential invader. This wasn't warfare. It was calculated genocide of Viking power. For the next 300 years, the Baltic would belong to those the Vikings failed to conquer. The terror would culminate in events that would shake Scandinavian civilization to its core. But that ultimate vengeance still lay in the future. For now, the immediate aftermath was enough. Viking expansion was dead, and the age of Baltic revenge had begun. 333 years after Apule, divine justice arrived in Sigtuna. The 1,187 sacking represented more than military victory. It was historical vengeance served cold. Baltic warriors, now including Estonians, Curonians, and Karelians, struck Sweden's holy heart. They burned churches Vikings had built with eastern plunder. They slaughtered priests who'd blessed raids on pagan lands. The archbishop's death carried special symbolism. The Christian god who'd failed to help Olof at Apule couldn't protect his highest servant from Baltic steel. Stockholm's founding directly resulted from this trauma. Sweden needed a fortified capital that could resist Baltic naval assault. Every stone laid in Stockholm's foundations represented Swedish acknowledgement of permanent vulnerability. The city exists because Apule taught Sweden that Baltic peoples could strike anywhere, anytime. Urban planning followed military necessity narrow approaches, defensive positions, limited landing sites. Vikings had become fortress builders hiding from the sea they'd once ruled. The Crusader solution to the Curonian problem revealed Christian desperation. Unable to defeat Baltic pagans militarily, Scandinavians invited German military orders to subjugate their tormentors. The Northern Crusades succeeded where Viking armies failed, but at terrible cost. Teutonic knights and sword brothers accomplished what Danes and Swedes couldn't, yet Baltic resistance continued for centuries. The last Curonians maintained their pagan faith and warrior culture into the 16th century. Modern Baltic DNA studies confirm what medieval chronicles reported. Massive population displacement followed the Viking Age reversal. Scandinavian genetic markers decrease sharply after 850 AD in eastern Baltic regions. Meanwhile, Baltic ancestry increases in Swedish and Danish coastal areas, evidence of successful raids and settled populations. The Vikings who terrorized Europe left descendants who were themselves terrorized by Baltic peoples. Philosophical reflection on empire cycles reveals universal patterns. Every dominant power creates its own downfall by teaching enemies its methods. Rome trained the barbarians who destroyed it. Vikings educated the Baltic peoples who ended their expansion. The skills that create empires become weapons in subjects' hands. Apule demonstrated this principle with brutal clarity. The students had surpassed their unwilling teachers. Viking invincibility died at Apule, but the concept took centuries to fully perish. Scandinavian armies would win other victories. Norwegian raiders would still plague European coasts, but the unstoppable expansion ended in Lithuanian mud. When warriors pray to enemy gods and pay tribute to former victims, psychological dominance shifts forever. The Viking Age didn't end with Christianity's triumph. It ended when Baltic peoples proved pagans could defeat pagans. The prayers for protection had indeed reversed completely. Where once Baltic mothers taught children to hide from dragon-proud ships, now Scandinavians begged for salvation from Baltic raiders. Churches that had echoed with thanks for Viking victories now rang with pleas for divine protection from Curonian vengeance. The very peoples Vikings had dismissed as primitive barbarians had become Scandinavia's greatest fear. Now you see why Scandinavia changed forever after Apuole. The siege didn't just kill 10,000 warriors, it murdered an entire worldview. Vikings learned that successful raiding created future enemies. They discovered that teaching warfare through example meant training their own destroyers. Most importantly, they understood that no people remain victims forever. This is why history forgot them. The winners wrote nothing. Curonians left no sagas celebrating their victories. They built no monuments to battlefield glory. They simply continued living as they always had, free on their Baltic shores, while Scandinavia nursed wounds that would never fully heal. The greatest Viking defeat came from peoples whose names barely survived, whose victories went unrecorded, whose legacy lives only in Scandinavian nightmares and Swedish prayers for protection from the East.